Good morning. Good morning. Um, Good morning, everybody. Great you're all here. Um, I hope you all enjoyed last night's extravaganza at Paradiso. I think a few are still recovering, but they will join us in a bit, I guess. Great to start the day with the first session, um, setting the record straight. Um, We have the Autolit group. We have Annie Fletcher, who is, I think, walking in as we speak, or almost. She had some small delay. And with Emma Olokau Wanamba. This first session will be moderated by Emily Petik, if I say your last name right. Emily is currently director at the Rijksacademie here in Amsterdam. Before that, she used to run Showroom in London for quite a long time. And before that, she was involved in Casco in Utrecht. So there is quite a history here. I would like to welcome Emily to introduce the day.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this, what's been an incredible program the last couple of days. I'm also really happy to be here with old friends and collaborators, the Otolith Group, Annie Fletcher and Emma Waluka-Wanamba, all of whom I've worked with in my last role at the showroom. So it's really nice to be here with you all. We're going to start with the Otolith Group, and we're going to start with a screening of the third part of the third measure, but not the whole film, just an excerpt, and then Kojo, Anjali, and Annie will come and be in conversation about the film and kind of wider issues. I'm going to introduce, for those of you who don't know, the Otolith Group. The Otolith Group was established in 2002. It's a collaboration between Kojo Ashen and Anjali Kasaga. They're based in London, and their work emerges from traditions of the essay film and militant filmmaking, encompassing their celebrating moving image work and extending to writing, curatorial, and educational projects and installations of archival material. Their practice brings an expansive interest in science fiction and futurology, with unresolved histories particularly related to the global south. They have a significant solo show coming up at Van Abbe Museum later this year, opening I think on the 25th of May. But they've also had exhibitions at Casco, Office for Art Design and Theory, at the Showroom in London, and many others. They've also been in a number of biennials, such as recently Kochi Biennial. They're in the Bauhaus Imaginista project, which opens at the House of Couture on de Velde, also in March coming up. Gwangju Biennial, and many others. It's also wonderful to have Annie here, Annie Fletcher, who's the chief curator at the Van Abbe Museum and is literally at this moment finishing and moving to be the director of IMA in Dublin, which is a really exciting move. And we will talk more about maybe a sneak and a question about museums later. But first of all, I'm going to press play on the film, and we will join. And do you want to say things first?
Yeah, and I'm going to press play in the film. Thanks to everybody for coming out. My name's Kojo Ashen. I'm one part of the Otolith Group. And sitting there is Anjali Kasaga of the Otolith Group, next to Annie Fletcher, once of Van Abbe and now of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the new director. Thanks to everybody for coming out on a Sunday morning. We appreciate it very much. We're going to begin. Could you please lower the lights? Thank you.
I want to say a few words about the music. Number one is, there are 3 pieces on the program. The first is called Evil Nigger, and the second is called Gay Gorilla, and the third is called Crazy Nigger. Now, these 3 pieces that can be played by any number of instruments. The reason I have them for pianos here is for a practical reason. One can play this piece, therefore, with just 4 people and then 4 pianos. But if melody instruments were playing, probably a good number would be somewhere in the area of maybe 10 instruments, 10 to 18 instruments, usually on the same family. So therefore, another version could be for, let's say, 18 stringed instruments. These particular pieces, formally, are an attempt to what I call make organic music. That is to say, the third part of any part, or the third measure, or the third section, the third part has to contain all of the information of the first 2 parts, and then go on from there. So therefore, unlike romantic music or classical music, where you actually have different sections, and you have these sections, which, for instance, are in great contrast to the first section or some other section in the piece. These pieces, they're not exactly perfect. They're not perfect. But there's an attempt to make every section contain all of the information of the previous sections, or else taking out information at a gradual and logical rate. Now, there was a little problem with the titles of the piece. There were some students and one faculty member who felt that the titles were somehow derogatory in some manner, being that the word nigger is in it. These particular titles, the reason I use them is because, in fact, there's a whole series of these pieces, and they can be called a nigger series. Now, the reason I use that particular word is because, for me, it is what I call a basicness about it. That is to say, I feel in any case, the first niggers were, of course, field niggers. And upon that is really the basis of what I call the American economic system. Without field niggers, you wouldn't really have such a great and grand economy that we have. So that is what I call the first and great nigger, field niggers. And what I mean by niggers is that thing which is fundamental, that person or thing that attains to a basicness, a fundamentalness, and eschews that thing which is superficial, or can we say elegant. So that a nigger, for me, is that kind of thing which attains himself or herself to the ground of anything, you see. And that's what I mean by nigger. So there are many niggers. There are many kinds of niggers. There are, of course, 99 names of Allah, but then there are 52 niggers. And so therefore, we are playing 2 of those niggers. Now, the reason I use Gay Gorilla, G-U-E-R-R-I-L-L-A, that one, is because these names, let me put a little subsystem here. These names, either I glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of gorilla, that glorifies gay. That's to say, there aren't that many gay gorillas. I don't feel that gaydom does have that strength. So therefore, I use that word in hopes that they will. You see, at this point, I don't feel that gay gorillas can really match with Afghani gorillas or PLO gorillas, but let us hope in the future that they might. You see, that's why I use that word, gorilla. It means a gorilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood, because without blood, there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason I use Gay Guerrilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. Okay.
we're missing one half of the Otolith group, but hopefully she'll... So for those of you who'd like to see the full film, it's on at the Stedelijk, and I think it's only just for one more day. We're going to start with a few questions, and then we will open out for questions from the audience. First of all, so in the Sonic Axe Festival Guide, Julius Eastman's described as an Afrofuturist artist, a genius composer, and minimalist musician. How would you agree with those descriptions, and how would you describe Eastman's work? And how do you understand his legacy now? I don't know which one of you wants to start. Anjali.
You know, I think the role of the African-American new music composer in the 20th century always arrives to us as a kind of anomaly. We're used to African-American composers in the worlds of jazz, R&B, soul, rock music, folk music, but composition, there always seems to be what Fred Moten calls a kind of an oxymoron at the stake, at the heart of African-American composition. So we might be able to name certain names, such as Anthony Davis, or Donald Fox, or Julia Perry, or Terry Adkins, or Benjamin Patterson, but they're always somehow not at the center of the culture. They seem to be exceptions to the rule. And Eastman in some way falls into this category, but in some way he's an exception even to these exceptions. So I think the terms Afrofuturism, the terms of genius, the terms of minimal composer, they kind of reach towards what Eastman represents, but they don't really capture the kind of the uniquely disruptive capacity that Eastman brought to questions of new music, to the coherence of what we think of as the Euro-American avant-garde, and to what we think of as African-American music. He has this kind of, this transgressive quality. He was both a consummate insider and at the same time a kind of outsider. Maybe Leroy Jones's 1964 poem Black Dada Nihilismus, that conveys an aspect of Eastman's role, that he was both a consummate virtuosic figure. He was a composer, a vocalist, a pianist, an organist, a composer, leader of his own ensembles. At the same time, he was always somehow cutting across any of those categories. So I think, yeah, they begin to touch on Eastman's role, but they don't really capture part of the why Eastman, I think, has captured so many people's imagination at this moment in time.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult to talk. I mean, the term Afrofuturism is extremely complex. So, I mean, I don't see Eastman as a Afrofuturist as such. I think I see him as somebody who kept turning the expectations around and around and around, like the expectations of him as a composer. I mean, there's multiple gazes on him. That also includes kind of like a kind of black conservative gaze as well, in a way. But there was this sense that he was constantly turning this. I mean, you can see that in the introductory speech, introduction that he gives, you know. The fact that he kind of politicizes his blackness is very interesting in relation to the new music scene, which was fine as long as he was composing and just composing. But bringing blackness into it was, isolated him in many ways. And he was, and therefore, what does he do with that isolation? He turns it even more. He queers it even more. He keeps, and for me, that is the most interesting aspect of Julius Eastman's work, is this, and then, and I think in the kind of sense that he was always composing not just in terms of writing music, but also in terms of writing text.
Can you talk, Anjali, a bit about why this work resonates for you both now? And you made the film in 2017, so how does it speak to that moment and to the now, to the present?
I mean, at the time, our good friend Mark Fisher had committed suicide and died. And basically, I think making this work was like a eulogy to him, in a way. But also, there was this sense that, again, like in the introduction that Eastman gives, there was something in it that was prescient then and is prescient now, that continues to be important in relation to the militancy of his of the speech, but also then of the music. I mean, the new music scene is extremely complex for black musicians and composers to be part of. It's a very exclusive scene and always has been. And I know that because I was working in the world of presenting experimental music in London and working as a musician for many years. So I mean, it's very interesting to have gone through that and then to be faced with Eastman and his life, and being able to make this work around his work as such. And I think also the challenge of how to make visual his music was just a challenge for us that we wanted to explore.
So Julius Eastman died in 1990. You know, he died homeless in New York. And maybe it wasn't until about 2007 when one of his colleagues and friends, a composer called Mary Jane Leach, she assembled all of the existing tape recordings of his music and released an album called Unjust Malaise, which is an anagram, a beautiful anagram of Julius Eastman. So during his life, despite composing a lot of work and appearing in a lot of ensembles, there was no album of his own music. So it's only in 2007 that I heard his music in detail. So Unjust Malaise is on YouTube. You can hear it. You can buy the CD, the triple CD. And so his music immediately haunted me. I mean, I just thought it was incredible. I couldn't believe it. I also couldn't believe that I'd never heard his music. I thought I knew about new music. I thought I knew about so-called minimalism, and I just never heard anything like that. And I was kind of angry, actually outraged, and also scared that that compositions that were so intense and so joyous and such a kind of ecstatic intensity could just disappear. It was kind of horrifying to me, and it is horrifying. And in a way, we were always thinking about how to respond to that work. But it took a long time to work out a way of approaching it. I think I was intimidated by the forcefulness of his music. If you listen to this composition or The Holy Presence of Joan of Arc for 10 cellos, it's just phenomenal. It just comes roaring out. I think of this music as horses riding over your head. Just imagine a fleet of horses galloping towards you, and they just don't stop. They ride right over you, and then as they ride over you, stand up and start cheering. That's part of what Eastman makes me feel, mixed with this horror. So in a way, the horror of Mark Fisher's death and the horror of Trump's election and the accumulating horror of African-American male and female deaths at the hands of police, all of that, in a way, created a feeling of anger, like just continuous anger. And the idea of a work that could respond to that work, respond to those feelings, respond to those events, the continuous drumbeat of death. In a way, at a certain point, we realized that maybe an Eastman composition would be a way to do that. So to me, Eastman's music now speaks to the kind of what people call the afterlife of slavery. It speaks to that moment that we're in which the violence visited on African American and Hispanic queer people of color, that violence is not contingent and accidental, it's structural and in some way functional to the system. That kind of permanent exposure to violence and to death, Eastman's militancy spoke to that. So we started thinking of Eastman's as its own protest music, not hip hop, not grime, but its own form of music. And so the more we thought about it, the more we thought we had to engage with it. And so I think those are the reasons why Eastman's music just started mattering to us. It just became the matter at hand, a matter of life and death, actually.
Can you talk a bit about how the work is kind of structured and dramatized? Because it begins with, unfortunately for those who haven't seen the full work, they wouldn't know that there's speeches both at the beginning and at the end. So it'd be nice to hear about those speeches, how they function and how they relate to the performance in the middle.
I'll say a bit about that briefly. So at the beginning of the video, you see a poet and a researcher called Dante Michaud, and he gives a 6-minute speech. And at the end of the video, you see a performer and composer called Elaine Michener, and she gives the same speech in very different styles. And then in the middle, you see the 4 pianists, Rolf Hines, Zubin Kanga, Siwan Rees, and Eliza McCarthy. You see the 4 pianists who perform Eastman's 1978 composition, Evil Nigger, for 23 minutes. No, 27 minutes. It's a 23-minute composition, but they play it for 27 minutes because that's take 5 that you see. So, and the speech that Dante starts with and Elaine finishes with is a speech that Julius Eastman himself gave on 16th January 1980 in Northwestern University in Evanston outside Chicago. He was invited to present 3 of his compositions, the composition Evil Nigger that you hear here, the composition Crazy Nigger, which you do not hear, and the composition Gay Gorilla that you don't hear. So there were 4 pianos on stage. Eastman is playing one of those pianos. And so there's been a controversy in the campus of Northwestern University, which at the time was a famously racist campus. And Eastman had put posters of the concerts around the campus, and some of the African-American students had complained because the inflammatory nature of the titles combined with the racist atmosphere on campus, and they were outraged by these titles. So there was a meeting, and Eastman agreed to take the posters down. So Eastman steps onto the stage, the Pick Steiger Concert Hall on Northwestern University, and he gives this 6-minute speech in which he lays out his philosophy of music, and then he lays out his concepts of the titles, like why. So we understand that he has a kind of economic understanding of the term nigger, and he has a militant understanding of the term guerrilla. And these feed into a kind of, actually an unprecedented analysis of these terms. So this is 1980, it's before. Reagan has not yet come into power, but he clearly is on the rise. The Soviet Union have occupied Afghanistan. The Palestinian Liberation Organization are at war with the Israeli Defense Force. Thatcher has come into power in Britain. So what we now know as neoliberalism is resurgent. Popular authoritarianism is on the rise. And it's in this context that Eastman steps onto the stage and gives this 6-minute speech, and to absolute silence. People are like, what is this? He gives the speech, and then he sits down and then plays the performances. So inviting Dante and Elaine to speak those, it brings this element from the past, because the idea of our video is that, you know, when Eastman talks about the gay guerrillas, he's talking about the future. He says gaydom doesn't have the courage yet of Afghani guerrillas or PLO guerrillas, but he hopes that it will. And in a way, that the idea of the video is that the 4 pianists, they are the gay guerrillas from 37 years into Eastman's future. So the composition calls to the future, and we are in his future. And they have come not to Eastman, but to us, because we need courage. The idea is that we ourselves, that's to say you, that's to say us, that's to say spectators, listeners, audiences, we need courage and fortitude and perseverance for the struggles that we are in right now. So in a way, the idea is that they've come to train us in concentration and focus and a certain kind of intensity. And so this is the idea. They come from Eastman's future to speak to us. So we think, in a way, we think of the video as a kind of training film to bring us up to scratch for the wars that we have to fight.
Anjali, perhaps you can talk about how it was staged, like the aesthetic decisions, how you filmed it.
There's a poem by Eastman, which I'll just read quickly, called, he writes, "Light streams through the darkness, opening the caves. Light, sorrow. Light cannot shine where no light is. Truth is light and darkness. More light, more light, more light, more light. Light is not darkness." It's from Julius Eastman, notes in the score for the Moon's Silent Modulation from 1970. You know, one has to remember that Julius Eastman comes from an esoteric Christian background, like a liturgical background. So this sense of light has a, you know, kind of multiple meanings, like in terms of, you know, the idea of enlightenment as such, and, you know, and this idea of, you know, wanting to scramble out of the Platonic cave into the light. But there's also so for us, this sense of light and darkness, yeah, we wanted to, I suppose, highlight these ideas by making the darkness darker and making the lighter in the film. The sense that, so we used literally the kind of black surface, like my shoes, like the black shiny surface of the piano, and worked with this lighting rig that actually, the idea of it comes from another film that we made on Don Cherry and the Cadona project, where we used this LED light system that would reflect onto the pianos, 2 baby grand pianos. This, in a way, created like a protective, invisible, not cage, but let's say an invisible aura, or a visible aura of refracted light around the musicians and around Eastman's composition. What is not present in the fact that we have 2 people front-ending and back-ending the work. This also, for us, was protected, but what isn't present is the fact that more people can say those words. So I think what we wanted to almost do was kind of create like this stage, this all of these ideas, but through these camera angles in a way. So the camera angles capture all these different, as you can see, they capture all these different lines of light. In a way, which I kind of think has a quite spiritual, futuristic, spiritual sense to it. And also, you know, when Edouard Glissant talks about opacity, opacity isn't a state of opaqueness. Opacity shines light back, shines a different light back. So I think, you know, to go to this idea of the structure of feeling, as Raymond William talks about it, a structure of feeling, I think this was very much what we were trying to create here, like to produce strange feelings, to produce a new state, a new sensibility around Eastman's work.
I'm going to bring Annie in here because there's an upcoming exhibition at Van Abbe Museum called Xenogenesis. Is that right? Title?
That's right.
So, Annie, perhaps you want to say...
Sure. I mean, I just loved watching this again this morning. It's for all of those reasons, like this incredible feeling of the call to order, this incredible feeling of energy, of course, discipline, intensity, as you said. And we're going to end the whole exhibition. So it's an exhibition with 10 rooms with this work. And I think we did this really consciously, right? As that moment where you maybe are calling to order the gay gorilla to come, or the evocation of new possibility. And this, I think, I mean, it to me, this piece, of course, brings to mind so much of what you're thinking about in relation to not only, you know, how he brilliantly enunciates the kind of racialized regimes of representation already and combats them or refuses them. And this kind of disruptive nature, I think, that is shot through the whole show in so many ways. It's going to be a show that I think Kojo said so beautifully, it's not a survey, it's not a retrospective, we're calling it a cross-section, a kind of an exploration. What would it be if we put these things together? So I'm kind of very excited by the idea that that intense moment is what sort of throws you out of the exhibition at the end. And it will be a project that will pretty much look at the last, from 2011 to now. Very, again, what's so exciting about what Kojo and Anjali are doing, I think, is this, that there's a sort of a refuting of this comprehensiveness of subjectivity. And the whole idea of xenogenesis, and again, I think you can both talk much more beautifully about it than I, but is an evocation from and the title of a trilogy from Octavia Butler. And it's really us trying to think about this idea of a generative alienation, a generative becoming something else. But something that, again, as we said, refuses the old regimes, refuses the toxicity of of what we've already produced, and tries to search for something new. So I think on that level, it's this project is so evocative and exciting in relation to that.
I'm aware of time, so I'm thinking it might be good to see if there's any questions in the audience. I can't see very well. If not, I have more.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for a beautiful session and a beautiful sharing of beautiful material. I want to ask just basic sort of musicological questions, because I'm not at all familiar with new music personally. And I'm interested just to know what perhaps within the context of new music was particular in Julius Eastman's cadence or rhythm, or I don't know even what the terms are. I mean, the only thing that I sort of gained from watching this presentation was the sense in which the hands were kind of picked up like claws, like it sort of physiognomically did something to the players to kind of claw at the keyboard in this sort of strange way. So I'm just interested to hear more about what was particular about the music itself.
I think Dante and Elaine, I just recently had a conversation with them about this, and we were talking about we did a podcast with them actually, which is going to come out, but we were talking a lot about this Julius Eastman's compositions. I mean, I would suggest listening to as many as you can that are on Unjust Malaise. But I think he is a composer, right? So he's playing with time. He's working with time. He's also setting almost like a challenge to musicians, and because they're difficult pieces to play. And there is a sense that Eastman knows that there won't be that many black musicians, maybe that will be able to, that will be, not that they won't be able to, but there won't be many that will play his music. Some people said to us, for instance, why didn't you have African American or black British musicians playing this? And actually, it's not that pianists don't exist, but well, number one, it was hard to find 4 pianists that could all play this piece, and also who had been working together for enough time. So it would have meant finding some African American or black British pianists or black European pianists, and then putting it together for a couple of years to play this, because that's how challenging it is. But I think the Eastman does set this challenge to musicians. Are you going to be able to play this piece? It's a physical test. I mean, these musicians are like gymnasts. They are like Olympic kind of gymnasts. I mean, they played this piece 6 to 7 times over 2 days, and it's a hard piece to play for 27. The composer, you can see, the hands are just like typewriter. They're almost typing, and they look like these biomorphic forms, like stabbing the piano. I mean, the militancy is there in the composition. You can hear it. It's horses, but it's also like, I don't know, it's also like hailstones, or again, there is something kind of like esoteric in the way the music is written. If you listen to the Holy Presence of Joan of Arc as well, you're listening to something that comes from beneath, definitely. Or from the cosmos.
I mean, I think you can't avoid a kind of allegory of the chromatic black keys and the diatonic white keys. You can't help but play out that stark opposition between chromatic and diatonic, between black and white. You can't help but transpose that into a racial allegory. And in a certain way, once we realized that we would work with these four pianists who are in the UK, they are the greatest living interpreters of Eastman's music. Zubin Kanga, he said maybe 23 people can play Eastman in the UK. Undoubtedly that's different in the US, but we were in the UK, specifically in London. So once you realize that, then in a way we decided to press into the ready-made racial allegory that the piano brings, and that allegory is simultaneously an allegory about tonality. So Eastman's music plays on a relation between the racial, the tonal, and the spiritual, and that's continually refigured in his music. And you know, as the music goes on, all of the ecstatic intensity drops away. It starts subtracting. It starts diminishing. It becomes more pointillist. And Eastman created a particular kind of notation to describe and to map this kind of arc. And there is a particular kind of tonal challenge that he sets. And you know, when you compare his work to Steve Reich or to Philip Glass or to John Adams or to Meredith Monk, it's clear that Eastman is maybe not necessarily a minimalist at all. You know, that's what people called him because the term minimalism has a prestige. So in a way, people thought they were elevating Eastman by calling him a minimalist. But what if he isn't at all? You know, you might call him a maximalist. You know, there were different terms, but I think of him as a certain kind of ecstatic music. In a way, I think of it as a new sacred music. I think that's Eastman was trying to elevate what he called black forces. And that was his term, black forces, which is a certain kind of spiritual and energetic impulse. And they were being manifested in this movement between the racial, the tonal, and the spiritual. And that's continually playing out from the Moon silent modulation that Anjali quoted right through to the end of his life in 1990, where at the end of his life, he's writing works like Hail Mary and Buddha. So then the kind of the pan spiritualist impulse in his music takes form. So I think those are some of the things at stake. And when you listen to Unjust Malaise, that becomes clear that that's part of the project, to create a kind of a new music that enhances black forces, that charges them, and that invites people into them because they are already there inside of America. You know, in fact, America is nothing but, American music is a kind of continual negation and incorporation of black forces. Okay, there's lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
I was wondering whether you could talk, because yesterday in Ramon Amaro's talk, he ended with a kind of looking at abstraction in relation to questions of identity. So I was wondering if one or both of you could, I know it's something you've talked to me about in the past, so maybe one of you.
I think the question of abstraction relates very well to the project that we've embarked on with Annie. I think I'd like to relate this question of abstraction to the question of xenogenesis. Xenogenesis is a term formulated by the African-American science fiction writer Octavia Estelle Butler. It's the name for the trilogy of books that she wrote at the end of the 1980s. Dawn from 1987, Adulthood Rights from 1988, and Imago from 1989. So these are three novels which rethink the relation between humans and aliens. So Xenogenesis translates as outside becoming, Xeno outside, Genesis becoming, or becoming outside, but you could also say alien becoming or becoming alien. So if you take these as a diagram of forces and processes, then the question of abstraction relates to this, because the question of abstraction relates to the necessity to undo the given image of what the human is, and to, in a way, to find a way to get in touch with that which is not human within the human, that which is inhuman within the human, whether you want to call that the drives. If you're a Freudian or a Lacanian, you could call that the drives, but Octavia Butler calls that the Xeno. So the Xeno is that which is outside the human but inside it. And of course, in kind of philosophical terms, the notion of the black, the Negro, is that which is outside the human. So the figure of the black person is that figure which opens the genre of the human. That's to say race. What is race? Race is a genre. This is Sylvia Wynter's notion. Race is a genre of the human in which the human continually generates that which is supposed to be outside the human, which then disturbs what we think of as the human. So it's this complex relation in which the question of race opens out onto the question of what it is to be human, what it is to be a being, and what it is to become human, and what it is to become a being. So the question of race and the question of human immediately opens out onto the questions of ontology and ontogenesis, between being and becoming. And the question of ontogenesis leads us to the question of xenogenesis. An abstraction is a vector, it's a line, it's a way of getting in touch with those forces which are there all the time, but need to be summoned, invoked, nurtured, and cared for. So in a way, it requires a practice to become outside, or to open to the outside that is already you. There is a practice that's required, and the sonic practices are as good as any other.
I think you could also apply the idea of a practice to kind of the Advaita Yoga Sutra kind of philosophy around, consciousness and all of that, but that's a whole other thing. I think of generative alienation and the practice of generative alienation as also a kind of practice of mutation, or a practice of becoming mutants, which happens, where does it happen? And I think when one begins to realize that the inner city is, a place like London, which was where Kojo and I are both born, where one could have time to think and become mutant and practice being alienated as such. You realize that this gives birth to an aesthetic. This gives birth to a series of refusals. You can find a way to protect your refusal through creating a practice. When you begin to realize that one's socialization, one's political socialization, one's ontology is completely under threat now, where it starts with Windrush. They've revoked the citizenship of this young woman. Will they revoke our citizenship? These are scary, upsetting, depressing times. I would never have imagined this would happen in the UK, where, we might lose our citizenship. Or, I can't even bear to think about it, but, where this threat exists, which is, you know, this awful Sadiq Khan is kind of like, you know, propagating. So you begin to realize that this this history of diasporic aesthetics are being actually eroded. In some cases, and you know, Britain, places like, I mean, every place has them, but I would say in the UK there was a definite exposure of those practices on television, in literature and in music, not so much in art necessarily in the you know, in the 70s or, you know, 60s, but or the 80s, they began with the Black Arts movement. These movements began to be kind of documented, I suppose, and presented. But, you know, certainly one begins to realize that you know, your history is being destroyed, and because Kojo and I have always been very interested and always felt that we needed to, this idea of passing on. Dante, again, we had this conversation recently about how does queer black presence get passed on? How does queer black culture get passed on? Because there's no children, or he said we don't give birth to children, so, you know, I mean, he said that. But so there's this sense that, you know, this is a history that could die. How does it get passed on, you know? And Kojo and I have been very determined in our work as curators to present the work of other artists, you know, because there is a sense that also, like in the 80s and in the 90s, there was a huge amount of support, or let's say there was a lobby for support, public funding for black art movements. That's all been taken away, more or less. So...
We're running out of time, but I did want to fit in a last question to Annie. As a as someone who works in museums, in a way, this morning is called Setting the Record Straight. So I was just wondering, since we have you here, if you could give us also a response to that in terms of what's the responsibility and role of the museum, what's the challenge, what can a museum do? Big question, I know, but a quick...
Well, it's amazing. One of the things I feel really happy about is as I'm leaving the museum that I'm accompanied by these two amazing artists in the last show I'm doing there, and that show is going to come to IMA. And I feel like all of the questions that they're bringing to the table are completely vital to us understanding the potential, again, of the museum space beyond its classic modernist, violent, strident sort of position as a kind of epistemological gatekeeper, and, as we said, a kind of a very white institution, and one that absolutely excluded many others. So I think it's all of that potential. And we've had a really great conversation about the idea of the exhibition as a trap, as a set of expectations and behaviors, and how one can play with that. So I think the potential of the museum is to understand all of those structures and to think, what now, what next? So it's a very propositional project, and I really do mean that. I feel like I will take the lessons from Xenogenesis very much on to the next museum, because I think it does exactly what Eastman is doing, exactly what we're talking about, understanding the terms and the nature of the call to order and the fight ahead.
Good to hear. We're going to move on now to Emma. I'm going to say a big thank you to all three of you. And Anjali and Kojo will join us again after Emma's presentation. So I'm going to introduce Emma. Emma's an artist based in London and Bergen. She's a research fellow in fine art at the University of Bergen, Norway, and convener of the Africa cluster of the Another Roadmap School. She works in a wide range of media formats and contexts. One of the recent exhibitions that she's going to talk about today is an exhibition that was co-commissioned by Angelica Kojo and myself at the showroom, and co-curated with the new director of the showroom, Elvira Jangani Osa. So that is why Kojo and Anjali will join back again after Emma's presentation. Emma's been in many different exhibitions and projects internationally, including Bergen Assembly in 2019. She was in the 10th Berlin Biennial last summer, We Don't Need Another Hero. And other projects include 1,000 Roaring Beasts display devices for a critical modernity at the Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo in Seville. You must make your death public at De Appel in Amsterdam in 2016. And she recently published an essay, Margaret Trial's School of Art, or How to Keep the Children's Work Really African, which was published last year by the Palgrave Handbook on Race and the Arts in Education. Emma, welcome.
Sebastian, did you press play? Okay. Good, so I don't have to do anything. Era de basebo ne banyabo mwebale kucha. I say in the program that I'm going to talk about promised lands, but I'm not really. But if you have any questions about the video that is part of the exhibition that accompanies the festival, I'm happy to answer those after this talk. I'm going to be talking instead, as Emily indicated, about the piece of work that they commissioned. So I'm talking about my work in front of the people who commissioned it, who I actually have also known for a very long time. And from before in the case of Kojo and Anjali, actually, from before the time that I entered the discursive and economic space of contemporary art. So to just give a little bit of background, I was invited at the, I think, November of 2017 to participate, to attend a meeting in Berlin that was organized by the curators Annette Busch and Marie-Hélène Gutberlet for a project called Women on Aeroplanes. This title comes from a Kojo Lang novel, and the project Women on Aeroplanes was one of the outcomes of a preceding research and exhibition project called After Year Zero at the House of World Cultures in Berlin that was looking at the moment of independence from formal colonial rule and beginning to think about what happened afterwards. In the reflections that the curators made following After Year Zero, they wondered why they had featured so few women in their exhibition. And this was strange to them, given that in almost every single case, women and organized groups of women played a very key role in achieving independence from formal colonial rule. So this project came into being. I think its primary initial focus was looking at film, but this then expanded. The Women on Aeroplanes has had iterations in Berlin, in Lagos, in Poland, and in London. I was invited to attend the meeting in Berlin, and I more or less warned that I wasn't really someone who had done a lot of work on women necessarily, and I wasn't really someone who had spent a lot of time thinking about the moment of anti-colonial organizing. A lot of my work had previously been engaged with the period of formal colonial rule, particularly in East Africa. But I brought to the table, if you like, a long-standing engagement with history and with historical materials, and with thinking around questions of how the historical record is constructed, what falls within and without it. In this sense, I have a long engagement with questions of the archive in the Foucauldian sense of the laws which govern that which can be said. And that then encompasses questions of the voice, of narrative, of mnemonic technologies, so technologies of memory, public memory, and beyond that, I suppose on a slightly more meta level, questions of hegemony and the institution in a very broad sense. So when Emily and Kojo eventually, after this meeting in Berlin, invited me to imagine a project for the London iteration of Women on Aeroplanes, I, being someone who tries to think fairly contextually, thought, well, London is historically one of the most important centres of organizing, of political organizing, of activism, and there will have been women here. It might be interesting to look at, or to try and find out about a woman who had played an important role in the City of London, and it was through this really that through this research that I first really learned about Amy Ashwood Garvey. And even though she's not here, I will take this moment just to say a thank you to Dr. Nydia Swaby, whose essay on Amy Ashwood Garvey and diasporic social spaces is really what turned me on to this woman. And I'd also like to thank Nadia because she was incredibly generous with me in her research, which she's been doing for many years, and in making some of her contacts available to me. I think the collaborative aspects of this kind of work is something that's very important, and the ways in which it connects with communities. I'll say something a little bit more about that in a minute. So the timescale for this project was incredibly short in comparison with the way in which I generally work or prefer to work. So going from an invitation in December 2017 to an exhibition opening in October 2019 was like supersonic travel for me, and particularly because it took a long time for the funding to come into place. So trying to work out what I was going to do and how I was going to do it was something that remained very provisional for a very long time. The first challenge really is that Amy Ashwood Garvey is someone who is not very widely known anywhere outside of some very specific communities of interest. And even though she was a major presence in London on and off between the 1920s and the 1950s, there is very little information about her that's actually available in the UK. And most of the material relating to her is in the US or in a little bit in the Caribbean, and most of it is held in collections, in archival collections that are devoted to her ex-husband, Marcus Garvey, to whom she was only married for about 3 months. So there was this. A major part of what I had to do was to try and find information about this woman. So I went on this very madcap journey last year, visiting archives in the US, in Jamaica and in Trinidad, and also I made a failed attempt to find her grave. And also, it turned out a failed attempt to find her papers. So one of the guiding principles of my approach, which perhaps was driven by time, but also I think driven by the core questions of women on airplanes, which was how and why do women disappear from the historical records of the mainstream historical records of independence, and in the case of Amy Ashweghari, also civil rights movements. And then there's a sub-question there, which is how women of color disappear from feminist movements, because she was also active in those. I tried to organize my inquiry around the moments or instances of disappearance. So tried to look at or try to pinpoint moments or instances that where this disappearance is enacted or reproduced. One very small example would be to do with acts of naming when it comes to archival collections. There is one of the archives I visited which has a video of Amy Ashweghari being interviewed. I went there specially to watch this video because I knew of no other place which had any kind of audiovisual recording of her. And it was very clear to me looking at this video that the footage had been shot in a television studio. It had been shot under professional conditions. And I was very surprised that the database record said that they didn't know the name of the interviewer or the date or place of interview. But I was convinced this couldn't really be true because it looked like TV. And then in another archive, I found, I think it's probably come up already, I found this poster that she herself had created to try and get speaking gigs when she was in the US in 1968, and it said, look for her on Gil Noble's Like It Is. Now, I had never heard of Gil Noble, but I went off and used our friend the internet and discovered that Gil Noble's show Like It Is was possibly the most important television show for the African American community in the US for decades, and that there was not one significant political or academic figure who did not appear at some point on his program. And therefore, Amy Ashweghari is part of this lineage. She's part of the history of that Like It Is and the work that Gil Noble did. I contacted the archive and I said, I think I know where this comes from. I've just found this poster which says Like It Is, and if you're an African American of a certain age, particularly one who works in archives of African American history, I don't imagine that you don't know who Gil Noble is. I mean, this is me saying this to you. This is not what I wrote in my email to the archivists. And I said also, there's this newspaper article as well, which shows that this program was actually screened, and this information hasn't been taken up by them. So what this means is that anyone researching Gil Noble, and I think a lot of people do, is never going to know that Amy Ashweghari was on his program, and it means that this woman is cut off through archival practices from other histories in which she was actually participant. This is one small example. Other ways that people like Amy Ashweghari disappear is the fact that she was completely unable to publish. She spent most of her life writing and trying to get books published and failing to do so. This seems to be a very important thing to do if you want to be, quote unquote, remembered. I think also having children seems to have, because then you have people who will carry on your memory. This is something that came up, I think, briefly in the discussion about Julian Eastman and having children and passing things on. So, for example, the second wife of Marcus Garvey, who was also called Amy, who had been the bridesmaid at the first wedding, she had 2 sons, and Amy Jacques Garvey spent her life working on her collection of Marcus Garvey material, and they were able to carry this on. Amy never had a family of her own. So this is just 2 small things that I would, I'm pulling out from many kind of historical instances that appeared in this. And I think the other thing that I tried to do was also to incorporate into the presentation accounts of my own research experiences, which were also indicative of this. So, for example, the Schomburg, another was, which I've given away the name now, it's the Schomburg Center, who don't care that Amy Ashford Garvey was on Gil Nobles like it is. The other would be the very interesting and in some ways completely terrifying attempt that I made to find her grave in Kingston, Jamaica. And various other things. So this is one, so I brought all of these materials in what I think it was Elvira very generously described as a temporary repository. She invited me to use the gallery as a temporary repository for the research and to think about it as a working space. The series of images that have just come up are a quite interesting reflection of that, because I found this image in the library, also at the Schomburg Center, and they knew nothing about it. And they didn't know where it was taken or what the circumstances were, but it seemed like, it somehow looked to me like it had been shot in London. I don't know how. This was an interesting question that I started to ask myself over the course of this research, is how do I tell the age of a photograph? But it really, or the location, but it somehow really looked like London. And I had this feeling that if I brought this picture to London, that someone might know something about it. And the historian Marika Sherwood, anyway, I'm going ahead of myself. So I made this poster, which I think has just been up, which had this photograph front and back. And then on the bottom, it has a list of all the organizations founded by and for women of color in the UK that we knew of at the time of publication. And the aim was, this was a free poster to take away from the gallery, and it was a way to disseminate the image and maybe find out more about it. And just 1 week after the exhibition opened, Marika Sherwood, who is a historian based in the UK, another incredibly generous person, wrote to me and said, I have the article, it's from the West Indian Gazette, which was published by Claudia Jones, and the article is entitled We Thank the Women, and is a wonderful article in which they hold an event, I think in Kilburn Town Hall in 1960 something, I can't quite remember now, where they've come together on All Africa Women's Day to talk about how, this is, sort of 50 years ago, how the role of women in the struggles against colonial rule and against apartheid is not being properly appreciated and supported. So I then had to, I then took upon myself the responsibility to change that area of the exhibition to incorporate the new information. And that's something that I have tried to be responsive to. It was on for 4 months. It closed at the end of January. I think, how are we doing for time? It's coming up for 20 minutes. I thought I had more to say. So let me just go back to my notes quickly. What have I missed out? Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges that I think I faced with this particular endeavor in comparison to previous has been that I usually work on material that people don't care about, where the stakes are quite low. So this means that I'm able to get quite a lot of access because people are very relaxed, because it's not really a big deal. At most, people might be a bit sort of puzzled as to why I care, but that's sort of fine. But what was very interesting about this project, and I think has really set me a set of challenges, is that it seems somehow in 2018, in 2019, to connect with a series, with a set of contemporary political urgencies. I think this is also something that Kojo and Anjali said, I think, more eloquently than me in their articulation of the work they've done on the work of Julius Eastman. But that again at this moment in time, the work of people like Amy Ashwagarvi, the practices of political organizing, and in her case, highly interdisciplinary practices of organizing are something that are being thought about, thought with, and taken up by communities of activists in Europe, in North America, in all sorts of different places. And this produced, or has produced for me, a different set of questions around what making an exhibition is, what it's for, and what my responsibility is in terms of working with this material. So, for example, and this is something that I still find quite daunting, is that at the moment, this is possibly the largest repository of material about Amy Ashwagarvi that is publicly accessible, because it comes from so many different archives, it comes from so many different places, but it's all together in one place. And if someone wants to work on this woman and her work, this is a place that they can do this. And I think that's one of the things I hoped was happening in the gallery, that people were able to spend their time looking at things and to take up the references and take up the material. But I now have to take very seriously the question of the afterlife of this exhibition, the afterlife of this material, and how it can be put to use within political life. And that's not something that which is not to say that the space of contemporary art, or that bringing this material into the space of contemporary art doesn't have a political use value, if you like, because that's absolutely not the case. But that there are other things that might or ought or might happen with this material that extend beyond the time frame of the exhibition and beyond the discursive context of contemporary art. And I'm trying now to think about that a little bit more seriously. I think because that's also to do with what kinds of constraints, possibilities and also constraints come with bringing this material into specific discursive fields. So I think this is something that I will continue to ponder on for some time, and to try to find ways to think about and to work with. I'm trying to maintain and expand the discussions and the relationships that I've developed through working on this material. And that's nothing which I haven't done before, but I think this somehow has a different sort of, there's a different kind of tension that's somehow at play. I think the only other thing I would like to really share at this point is two things, really. Not one thing, two things. Is that I don't think, I mean, the title of this session is Setting the Record Straight. And I don't think that's quite what I consider myself to be doing. In the sense that setting the record, it's a definite article, it's one record. And it's straight. And I think those speak to a kind of a sort of normative monological idea of history and how histories are taken up, produced, reproduced. One of my favorite words in English is remember, because it's remembering, putting something back together. And this is something that happens in different contexts, in different places all the time, highly socially contingent, highly culturally contingent. I think it's more, I think it's more about, for me, my position is I'm more interested in how certain kind of histories, certain kinds of stories about the past come to be written and how they become authoritative. And in the relationship between the ideological and the pragmatic and the arbitrary in those processes, because they are all at play at some level, the conscious and unconscious levels, on a conscious level, one very iconic example would be the liberation of Paris in 1945, when all the TV news cameras came to Paris to record the parades of soldiers who were liberating the city, and the armies, the Allies, deliberately took a decision to keep all of the soldiers of color out of the city so that they did not feature in the historical record of the liberation of the city, even though they had been there. So this is a very deliberate decision. Others can be quite arbitrary or purportedly pragmatic, like we need to move this statue from here to here, so we need to take this bit off the top because it's too big and it will block something else out. I'm talking here about the Memorial to the Women at War, which is in the City of London, which meant that because it had to be moved because of money, economic reasons, there are no figurative depictions of women in active service in defense of the British nation. So this is something which I find very fascinating. And in thinking about how, I think very fascinating how these processes happen and how can one productively intervene or pick holes or pull threads out of what, on one level, what everybody knows. The last thing I want to say is where the title of the talk comes from. The title, Carrying Yours and Standing Between You, is also the title of this exhibition, and it comes from, it's a quote from Amy Ashwood Garvey. It's from a quote from Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was one of the co-organizers of the International Association of Friends for Abyssinia, who met in the restaurant that she ran in London, restaurant and nightclub that she ran in New Oxford Street in London in the 1920s and early 30s. And when Italy invaded Abyssinia in 1935, they organized a mammoth demonstration in Trafalgar Square. And this is quite an interesting example of the way in which history can be, mainstream or normative history can be written by images, because the Getty has no images of her speaking. The Getty Archive, which is the kind of mother lode or Death Star of the photographic archive, they have no images of her speaking. They have images of men speaking at this event. They have a photograph that of a man a young man who may or may not be C.L.R. James. I'm still trying to figure that out. But there is another archive in Ohio, of all places, where they have a photograph of her speaking. But what she said on that day, apparently hers, according to the newspapers, was the speech that got the biggest cheers. And she says, you speak of the white man's burden, but we are carrying yours and standing between you and fascism. And this, I think, is really incisive. I mean, for me now, I read this as a really incisive reflection of the position that women of color like Amy Ashwood Garvey have taken. So carrying yours and standing between you and the abyss, or fascism being the abyss. But this betweenness and this burdenness doesn't translate into a certain kind of visibility or acknowledgement of agency within normative, heroic modes. And I think this is a very interesting discussion that I'm having with Nadia at the moment, and with other people that she works with, is thinking about other kinds of activism and how that activism is codified or interpreted or erased within normative modes of narration of political struggle. So I think I'll stop there, if that's okay, Emily. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. Where do you want to sit?
I'll sit next to my
Well, thank you so much, Emma. I feel like you've already answered a lot of the questions I had lined up for you, but I'm going to ask you to go deeper into some of them. Okay. And also, I'm going to ask Anjali and Kojo to respond.
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking, in a way, to start with the question of timeliness that I also asked Anjali and Kojo, and you touched on it briefly, but I wonder if you could go more deeply into why you, in a way, quite quickly in the project, zoned in on Amy Ashwood Garvey. Yeah. And I think there were a lot of, that her kind of work does present questions for the now in terms of her as a community organizer, as an activist, and I think it'd be nice to hear more from you about what you, and also in a way a process of research almost opens up questions rather than answers them. So
yeah, okay, so the timeliness. I think we all kind of know where we are, in a way. I think we all know what's happening at the polls, in the elections, in changes to legislation, in explicitly racist and illegal acts like stripping people of citizenship, which that's not on the table for the young boy who's in the news this week, the young British boy, he's aged 18, who says he wants to come back from Syria because he misses Doctor Who and pasties, and no one is calling for his passport to be taken away. So it is a lever that is explicitly being applied in the case of people with comparatively recent diasporic origins, or actually I would say people who are now in the UK, who are British, whose families come from the former colonies. I would prefer to bring that word back into use. So I think there is, what's the expression I'm looking for here? There are always these processes of rediscovery, these processes when people, these processes or moments where people look to history, they look to the past, they remember certain figures, they re-engage with the ideas and the work of certain figures in order to provide either intellectual or in some cases even just emotional sustenance in the contemporary moment, and as part of the process of formulating their contemporary political concerns and assigning them a lineage. And this is something that happens across the political spectrum. I think struggles over narratives for the past are at play more or less in every contemporary argument. This is my observation. And I think that in the case of someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, there is, as I said, as we all know where we are, someone like her who was a very defiantly international figure, her not statelessness, I wouldn't say she was stateless, but that her alliances and her allegiances were multiple. Her impact was international, is a figure who's very interesting and useful for people who are working now to think with in terms of trying to conceive of strategies for solidarity, strategies for organizing, ways of and articulating a lineage for these practices. So I think that's something that's definitely going on. I think certainly in the UK, certainly in London, and I learned this a lot from working with Nadia, is that who wrote her PhD on the history of organizing of women of color in the UK, is that this movement is on the rise again. And this is happening on many levels in terms of fights for housing, fights around strike, fights for around education, around income. The campaign for a living wage, for example, in the UK, which has become a very, the lowest waged, it's gendered and racialized. So this, and also to do with papers. So this is also another movement in which the kinds of work that Amy Ashwood Garvey was doing across the UK, across Europe, and across Africa, and across the Caribbean, and across the US, between leaving Marcus Garvey and dying in 1969, becomes a very useful resource for thinking about strategies. What's also possible to do now with the maturity of certain kinds of Black feminist discourses is to be able to see, understand, and to valorize the kinds of practices that she was engaged in as legitimate political activity. So whereas the kind of normative male mode is very much driven by speeches, pamphlets, talking, but actually running a restaurant and a nightclub can itself be part of the struggle. And this is not only is this because it's a way of making money, this is a huge question that I started to ask myself, is how do you, and this is before charitable foundations and whatever, how do you make a living? How do you eat while you do this work, particularly if you don't have a husband, in the 1930s or whatever. So running a restaurant, putting out records, running a nightclub, not only are these spaces where people met to organize, but they also provided really important spaces of repose and spaces for recharging in the course of in the course of what we know to have been incredibly drawn out, very, very acrimonious, and in many cases extremely violent political campaigns. So actually, these spaces in and of themselves have an enormous value and a structural impact on the abilities of these struggles to sustain themselves. But this is something, this kind of work becomes devalorized because it becomes feminized. And of course, women's work doesn't mean anything within a certain framework that I hope most people in this room are actively challenging on a daily basis. So I think this is a space where someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, and the kind of prescience of it really as well, you know, to be doing social work avant la lettre, you know, to be being the social worker, to be fighting around housing, to be helping to organize basic things like accommodation for people in a place where there was no, you know, it was often very hard, and even still can be, to find a place to live. So I think finding a way to remember, to create a lineage, and also to draw sustenance on many levels is the way that someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey seems to have it seems to have found its moment. And what was very interesting, actually, is that many of the activists who I've met, young activists I'd met in London through working with Nadia and making this exhibition, had never themselves heard of Amy Ashwood Garvey before the exhibition. So it's giving them something. It was also it was a surprise, but it was also really exciting because, as I said, there is a possibility here for this to be taken up out beyond the time and space of the gallery exhibition.
You talked about how you used the space of the exhibition as a kind of repository and a working space. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you about, in a way, like a broader question about the space of art mm-hmm. and what, like a practice like this, like what you can use the space of art for in relation to this kind of work, research, and how you see it as a kind of practice, let's say an art practice.
Oh God. All the easy questions, like what's 2 + 2? I'm going through another period at the moment of not quite knowing what I'm doing, and struggling to find words to describe it. I think that's because some of the words I used to use have their currency has shifted. So I think for me, talking about research 5 years ago is something quite different from talking about research now. I also, full disclosure, say this as someone who has accidentally found themselves in a PhD program. I didn't join a PhD program, but it is one now, and it's a PhD in artistic research, which I have a strange relationship with, because on the one hand, I think those two words are quite useful words to think with in terms of what I do, but at the same time, the way in which they're perhaps interpreted, or the kind of frame that they produce within the context of this PhD program, isn't one that with which I necessarily identify. I think a little bit like Irit was saying yesterday, that if I understood her correctly, is that there are possibilities that can open up in the space of contemporary art that are not necessarily possible in other places. I think one of those is to do with temporal engagements, I think in a really basic way. I think people spend time in galleries in a way that they don't really nearly anywhere else. Perhaps the cinema is the other space, but in this world where
everything is faster and faster and we're all constantly moving, that being able to go to a place where things are quite slow, and it has a value in relation to the things that I'm interested in sharing, and in the kinds of questions that I'm interested in exploring together with other people. I think that's something which is really valuable about moving into that space. And also that this is something that can have a duration. So not only is there the space, there's also the space of the space and time of one's visit to the exhibition, but there's also the fact the exhibition might be on for quite a long time. So lots of discussions and can evolve, over the course of what in the end for me was 4 months. That I can make this poster and then Marika can tell me, actually this is this, and then I can move things on, is something I find very exciting. I can't remember who the name of the theorist who coined the term scavenger methodology. I can't remember, maybe somebody in the room knows this person. But I think that the kind of post-conceptual contemporary art space allows for this possibility somehow, that you can draw on, incorporate, mimic, a variety of different modes of address, modes of practice that allow things to come together and to be thought together within this framework that would be more difficult to achieve in the context of, say, the Academic Association of Historians conference, or in an article for a newspaper. I think this is also to do, again, a little bit with my questions about setting records straight, because there's a multi-trajectory possibility in terms of the encounter with materials in the space of the exhibition, which is not the same as reading an article from beginning to end. Is not the same as you can come in from different angles, exit from different angles, make different connections, and not pin something down. And I think that's also something which is really important. The other key thing for me, really, speaking about, I'm trying to avoid so many words, talking about what I do, is that in thinking about history and the historical record or practices of historiography, there is somehow always an image, there is somehow always an exhibition. This is an area of practice which has been of cultural practice, which is so influential in terms of producing our ideas and our understanding of the past, to the point where we don't even necessarily recognize it. And I think bringing this responsibility back to the space of the exhibition is something that I feel is very important. I'm thinking, while saying this, of a piece I made a couple of years ago called Von Eingeborenen beschädigt, which in English is Damaged by the Natives, which was for an exhibition at Kunsthaus Dresden that took as its starting point the colonial exhibition of 1939 that the Third Reich, it was on at the time that the Second World War began. And the logo of the exhibition of the colonial exhibition of 1939 was the Reiter Memorial, the Reiter Denkmal, which was made by Adolf Köhler, who was a German sculptor in 1919, for the city of Windhoek in what was then German Southwest Africa, to commemorate the 104 Germans who died in the Herero and Namakwa uprising, and which latterly the German government has finally conceded as an act of genocide. So this memorial was then taken up by the Nazis as the symbol of the wonders and glories of German colonialism.
And it's a statue that commemorates and conceals a genocide. And therefore, in the moment of its reactivation in Germany in 1939, also then prefigures another act of genocide. And my whole interest in this began because I found a picture of Nazi officers standing and posing proudly in front of a photograph of this memorial. So I'm kind of interested always in trying to find out who which artists were there, which photographers were there, who helped to produce, or whose work was used to produce, legitimate, and solidify certain kinds of ideas about the past. And the Reiterdenkmal, by the way, is still in Windhoek and has only recently been removed from public display. But it's still there because the German settler community is still incredibly powerful in Namibia. So.
I'm going to pass over to Angelica and Kojo to see if you have questions or responses to Emma. You've got a mic there.
Wow. It is interesting because I just would like to expand on this idea of setting the record straight in terms of kind of institutionally, how there is you talk about these, we're talking in our work and in, I'm going to leave the women on aeroplanes bit to Kojo. I just wanted to sort of talk about something else. This question of setting the record straight, this kind of demand on perhaps people of colour to set the record straight for institutions, as opposed to these moments, I would say, in cities like London, where there was no need for quantification or qualification, that people of colour didn't need to quantify their experience and qualify their experience. This sense, I was thinking a lot about how when one is born inside a city like London and one experiences racism for the first time, you realise that you have already experienced the end of the world and you need to build your future. You need to bring history with you, otherwise it's just going to die. So this sense of protecting our refusal to ameliorate the guilt of institutions. I'm thinking of, how artistic research and practice of people like of our generation, where maybe we have that knowledge, we know not to do that, and how there is this sense that when the institutions were involved in, when people like Stuart Hall, questioned the authority of and the funding of white institutions and public money, how that already happened quite a while ago now, and we've been able to think, or the potential is to think with institutions in a more critical way, which at this point isn't about us coming in to set the record straight. It is about those institutions asking themselves some hard questions about their amnesia and their desire not to feel the pain of their colonial suffering, the suffering that they have brought and the suffering that they carry by repressing, by always asking others to ameliorate, in a way. So, I'm just thinking about this ability that or our right to slow things down and not qualify or quantify, but our right to actually research within a condition of freedom. Yeah, not emancipation.
Yeah,
no,
just
definitely.
Just to pick up on that, and to maybe kind of both compare and contrast the two projects. Making the Julius Eastman video, the third part of the third measure, took place within a moment of what Bonaventure calls the rhetoric of rediscovery of Julius Eastman, or what George Lewis calls the uncomfortable project of recovery. So just in the last 5 years, we've seen concerts, exhibitions and festivals in, let's see, Venice, in London, in Oslo, in Berlin, in New York, and in Philadelphia, just in the last even 5 years or so. And so, and all of these festivals or conferences or concerts have a kind of self-congratulatory tone by which they recover Eastman from the darkness of obscurity and forgetfulness and bring him back into the light. And this mode of kind of recovery and rediscovery, in a way, we really wanted to question this, and the way in which the video does that is by trying to open up a perspective and forward-looking, future-invocative notion of what Eastman's project is, so that it's not only a question of contrition and apology, and the institutions who take on that task of restitution or reparation, and to try to open up a different frame. And I think part of Emma's point, which I find really compelling, and part of why Emma's work was so productive, generative, and important, was that point when you said you try to enact moments of disappearance, so that it's not so much filling in or recovering or recuperating or repairing history. It's the reverse. It's focusing the lens upon those moments when history, when acts of disappearance and acts of interruption to history happen, slowing those down so you see how what people have called agnosia, so that you understand how that happens. And part of that is to displace the demand for setting the record straight. So you see that demand coming, and you find a way to step aside from that demand rather than to reply. And I think it's critical, because I think what is at stake is an intergenerational practice, because I saw how many different generations of people came from undergrads and younger, teenagers and 20-somethings, up to researchers and people in their 70s and 80s. I saw them coming to the showroom. So this intergenerational interest in the work of Amy Ashwood Garvey really points to the question of what is a generation. And the historian David Scott says we can understand a generation as a community of memory that is bound by crisis, by relation to crisis. Whether you have directly experienced that crisis or not is not as important as the fact that it's the crisis and your relation to it. And in a way, part of what you did, I think, is bear the crisis of the work of disappearance and interruption. That's why that portrait of Amy Ashwood Garvey in negative is so important, because that image somehow brings that enactment of disappearance. It confronts us with it and asks us what we will do with that. And so in the moment of that confrontation with that portrait, you sense all the violence of disappearance, the work of interruption. It all takes on a portrait, it all takes on a visible form of negation. And that it's such a profound moment. And in a way you feel yourself being generationally hailed by that moment of visible negation, the moment of visible disappearance, you know, how to make disappearance appear. And this is what you did. And it was really a profound experience, I think, for those who took the time to make it across town to Edgware Road. So I wanted to thank you for that, because because it was really, it was a pleasure to work with you, and it took a while. It was both a long project and very short. But that moment was a profound moment, I think, for many people. And in a way, I've only just been able to find the words to articulate that experience.
Okay. Well, Emma, I'm going to hold you because we are running over, and I want to see if there's questions from the audience. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question for Emma? One over there.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's really enriching both conversations. My brother studied Marcus Garvey at university, so I can't wait to go back and tell him about your work. I'm really excited about that. So my question really, Emma, was kind of advice around you kind of re-entering, entering academia, and kind of the questions that you're starting to pull together around how you create a space or work with others in that space, which will potentially be a challenging space. So I'm just interested kind of around your preparation of this context that you're going to enter. Just interested in that really.
Well, in one sense, I'm always already in it. I already have 2 degrees, and I more or less have organized my post-art school life by always trying to have some kind of academic institutional affiliation, and that's partly about precarity because I don't make any money whatsoever from my work. It can only exist in an environment of grants and self-subsidy, and also because academic institutions mean you can have libraries, you can get to the library, and this is something that has always been a big part of what I do. So I can't in any way claim outsider status in relation to academia. That's a non-starter. I think, although what I would say is, and I think maybe this is a particular pressure that this whole artistic research PhD situation is forcing on me, is it's bringing what I do into the academic institution in a different way from other ways in which I've been involved there, and that's the bit that's a bit scary because there's all sorts of bits of paper and descriptions and policies and the rest of it that surround that, and I think I purposefully avoided ever doing a PhD by practice because I just didn't ever feel like I wanted to have that sort of conversation about what I do. Although I do write a lot, and I'm really comfortable with that, more or less. So if I take a little bit of a side sweep, maybe, just to answer your question, is to talk very briefly about another roadmap school, which is this art education research project that I've been involved in since 2012 and really heavily involved in for about 5 years now. And I organize, my primary responsibility is to organize a consortium of research projects into art education in 8 African cities. I work and have been working very closely with art educators in Uganda since about 2011. And one of the, this is helping, I suppose, this is really long-winded. This is helping somewhat to allow me to think otherwise about how education or cultural education might work. From one pole, to come back to your brother's friends, the Marcus Garvey Pan-African Institute, who will no longer speak to me, who believe that the university is fundamentally a Eurocentric way of producing and controlling knowledge, and will have nothing to do with it, and are trying to develop alternative forms of high-level education that escape those logics and escape those kinds of economies. That's at one pole. At the other pole, and this is one that I think about a lot, is that apart from the working group in Cairo, where they speak Arabic. We can't, amongst us and the context that we know, we don't know a single indigenous African language with a word that translates to the word art. So whenever people talk about art, visual art, capital A, they use English, French, or Portuguese. And this doesn't mean that historically these peoples, these communities were not creative. It just means that what constituted cultural production and its social and economic and distribution was just different and not captured by a Western post-Renaissance terminology. And I think that an involvement in this project has given me a level of optimism about thinking about what I do and what others might do or what might be possible that is not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily take sort of, to come back to your question of hailing, doesn't heed the call of the Western academy or the Western academic framework, and finds ways to acknowledge and to acknowledge, to valorize, and to draw upon other knowledges and other practices. So I think this is something, even while I sit inside the academy, I try to think with a lot. I found the work of Sarah Motter really useful in this respect. I don't know if you know Sarah Motter. She's now a professor at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She used to be, I think, at Nottingham Trent, and is a specialist in the role of pedagogy in popular movements, particularly in Central and South America. And she did a lot of really interesting experiments in Nottingham in trying to find ways to bring critical pedagogies and the practice of critical pedagogy into the university. And she's someone whose work I think about a lot as someone who's tried, has already an experience of trying to think, to create spaces for thinking differently from within, if you like.
I'm afraid that we've run out of time. Yeah. There's many more things we could talk about, but they will have to happen informally in the break. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Emma, Anjali, Kojo, Annie for earlier, and for Sonic Acts for inviting us.